Today I'm having my friend Christova or Drake and Ash's hybrid, the Ptinvatators, versus one of my more disturbing hybrids, the Atroxvulcris hive. Not the full hive. Not the full hive. I'm going to get into that in a second. But essentially, I'm putting three of each of these species up against each other in this fight, as both of them typically fight in groups. This is, I believe, my first verse battle that isn't one of my hybrids versus a more popular channel. I think I did Samson from Madly Mesozoic, um, Primatus Rex, and Ultima Imperatrix, which are all obviously from larger channels. So this is the first time I'm going up against a channel closer to my size range. And he has a pretty good hybrid at that. So I'll go ahead and start breaking this down by categories, and there'll be a fight animation towards the end of the video, then an explanation on why the fight went the way it did. But before I even get into the categories, I should probably explain what type of DNA is in each hybrid. Starting off with my friend's hybrid, the Ptinvatators, or his main hybrid being Furiosa, a larger female member of the species, who will be the largest member of the species in this fight, along with her mate, and I'm just kind of making her have a, sub-adult daughter in this too, which would be around the same size as males. Males are smaller than females in this. So that's the trio that's going to be in this fight. The base of the species is the Giga, or the Giganotosaurus, whatever you want to call it. This massive theropod, I don't know if he's using the real life or Jurassic Park variant. Judging by the weight, I'm assuming he's probably using the Jurassic World variant, and also since the Jurassic World Giga is significantly stronger than the main thing, and obviously this hybrid was in the Hybrid War, unlike the Atroxvulcris, so using Jurassic World stuff was totally fair in that. So I'm going to assume, for the sake of the video, that it's probably the Jurassic World Giga, and I'm assuming most of the dinosaurs in this are the Jurassic World variants, not the real ones. But honestly, it doesn't really matter, as this is a more realistic breakdown, as some people would call it. Meaning that since all these creatures technically would exist within the same Jurassic World universe, that they're all going to auto-scale to other things in that universe. So even if they were using realistic dinosaurs, it realistically shouldn't scale to stuff like ramming through an aviary at 5 tons worth of TNT, or taking a shotgun blast to the tongue, or, you know, all that crazy stuff that stuff like the Indom and Giga and T-Rex pull off consistently in verse. They do now because they're in the same universe. I believe that's also what Goji Center tries to do with their videos. They just don't make that clear, which leaves some people thinking a real-life T-Rex could do the stuff that happens in Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. Which they can't, that'd be physically impossible, but enough of that tangent. The other DNAs within this creature include Tyrannosaurus Rex, Deinosuchus. These two would probably most likely help with bite. I know the Deinosuchus in particular is basically what this thing's teeth are modeled after, as well as its immune system to help with some limited venom and poison immunities. And the Tyrannosaurus Rex helps with stuff like its tail, its leg strength, and overall like bulk, stuff along those lines. So this creature is automatically stronger than like a real-life Tyrannosaurus Rex or the Jurassic Park / Jurassic World variant just off that DNA alone. So have DNA from a larger species of hadrosaur, which helps them basically stay on 4 legs and allows them to be either quadrupedal or bipedal. It also helps a lot with stability and adds their size a lot. We also have DNA in the armor part of their breakdown right there from a essentially less extreme version of an Ankylosaurus with better like spikes. I'm not going to really try to pronounce some of the names here, because although I probably could, I'd have to re-record this a trillion times, and it would probably still sound kind of bad. So, if you want to know the exact creature, you can look at the names right there. I'm going to post both genomes in a pinned comment on it, or maybe not pinned, but my own comment under the video, and I guess you could just search the creatures there. But this thing's armored pretty well for, you know, a theropod. It's not as insane as like an Ankylosaurus's armor, but it's still definitely more than enough to keep this creature protected from most things. You add on the Deinosuchus DNA, already also amping durability. This thing can take a pretty substantial beating before actually, you know, going down. Creature's arms are also incredibly dangerous and end in massive claws due to both the mouth macrothorax DNA, which, if you don't know, is pretty much one of the most insane arms you're ever going to find on a dinosaur. and also some of the most insane claws you're ever going to find on a dinosaur, as well as a species of giant ground sloth, which amp that even further. If anyone's seen my video on Loricodon versus Ultima Imperatrix, you know how insane that is on a theropod. And this thing essentially has a slightly less, like, over-the-top variant of that, but it's still that. I mean, this thing's overall strength is pretty insane. It would also know how to fight with these arms due to that DNA, and as well as the Giga in Jurassic World also kind of trying to use its arms despite them being tiny. And most of the other DNA in here allowing for the creature to be capable of using that. These creatures also are highly social and are capable of learning how to use things that aren't necessarily instinctual to it. Kind of like the Umberbalua, one of my hybrids, learning to use its prehensile tail, despite that not really being very high on its instincts. So basically what I'm saying is this creature could learn to use weapons that it's not necessarily designed to know how to use instinctually. And regardless, I do think it would be able to use them instinctually just off having both of those things in its genome. So with all that, this creature is most likely a almost omnivore, not full omnivore. It'd be a carnivore that most likely occasionally would supplement its diet with plants, kind of like how a dog will occasionally eat grass, except probably not exactly like that. The creature probably does still need some nutrients from plants to, stay alive, but since these are massive, like, pack-hunting super mega theropods, I don't think they're going to have any real competition there. And then obviously when it comes to hunting, these creatures do actually have lore, and in their lore they do actively hunt sauropods, semi-regularly actually. So these things are capable of bringing down things far larger than themselves, and there's no real specification on what type of sauropods they're taking down. But assuming these guys most likely very much upscale Zeb, the Giga from Jurassic World Dominion, they could most likely take down sauropods as large, if not larger, than Dreadnoughtus, the Jurassic World variant of Dreadnoughtus, which is still massive. So most likely they could take down pretty much any sauropod in real life as well. And when it comes to packs, these packs are typically around 5 members, the 2 parents, and then the up to 3 or maybe sometimes more offspring. For this it's only 3 because I'm only having 3 Atroxvulcuses. But the way their packs are set up is kind of like real life wolf packs, not the weird outdated alpha wolf bullshit that people still believe for whatever reason, even though the guy that made it literally spent his entire life trying to kind of take it back. But like how an actual wolf pack is set up, more like a family unit. The alphas, quote unquote, would be the parents, the male and female that basically made the rest of the wolf pack. And then the children would be the backup until they get old enough to go make their own pack with some other wolf somewhere. So typically these packs would be 5. For this, it's only 3 with a sub-adult female. I feel like most likely they would leave by the time they're a sub-adult, but for this, we're just assuming that this one decided to stay a little bit longer than they should. So, yeah, they're definitely overpowered for a predator, especially compared to real-life things. These things would absolutely maul a T-Rex, and that's in a 1v1, with even the smaller males being able to absolutely murder a T-Rex. Now, onto the Atroxvulcus's whole genome. These guys are kind of insane. Before I really even get into them, it's important to note that basically every single variant of these guys evolves entirely differently, and it has fully, like, completely different adaptations for what they're supposed to do. They're a lot like bees or ants in that way, where some of them have literally super different appearances to the other members of the hive because they have a different purpose. But these guys also have some insane lore. Before I really even get into what their whole scaling is later on, these guys are canonically basically a planetary threat. They're kind of like a more grounded, well, quote-unquote more grounded version of the Tyranids from Warhammer 40k, in which they basically will just wipe out all life on the planet through just killing and eating everything. These guys are made by the same exact people, well, the same main guy that made the InGen Trio. It's not the same people because the InGen Trio kind of killed the rest of them. The InGen Trio, if you don't know, was my original 3 hybrids, Umbreodon, Timatosaurus, and Loricodon, which are all pretty decent as they kind of won their first matches prior to this, but the Atroxvulcris was his final hybrid, essentially a ultimate species that would wipe out all life on Earth. And that was exactly what he was going for. If you're wondering why this guy was doing that, I'm going to have a whole lore video on all the hybrids eventually, but it's kind of convoluted and a little weird. But ignoring that, these guys are canonically able to kill literally anything in the Jurassic World verse, as well as basically take on and potentially kill any of the hybrids I've made, or hybrids that my hybrids can take down. Meaning things like Samson aren't safe from them. Things like the Indom 2.0 wouldn't be safe from these guys. Even if the Indom 2.0 could take down a single one in a fight, these guys tend to travel in packs of well over 1,000, sometimes in the millions. They literally build hives larger than most mountains, so yeah, they're a major threat. However, in this, there's only going to be 3 because this is a scouting party. Scouting parties tend to range anywhere from around 2. If it's 2, it's typically both dragons, all the way up to well over around 300 to sometimes over 500. For this, we're doing a very small scouting party of 3, a dragon, a builder, and a warrior. The reason they sometimes send out very little scouting parties is to areas they don't actually think have much worth to them. Whereas they'll send the much larger scouting parties to places they think are an actual threat to them, usually human cities or massive human settlements like that. So for this, it's essentially this pack is running into a very small pack of Atroxvolucris. They're not fighting an entire swarm. That would be very unfair to them. The main DNA that these creatures have for their overall body shape and build is from the mount macrothorax. Same DNA as in its opponent's arms to give it that insane arm strength, along with the ground sloth. These guys, although they look like a mount, they don't act like one. They are very much different. However, they do still have the massive claws, huge arms, and overall body shape and build of one. They're also significantly larger than one, largely due to the Orca DNA they have. The Orca DNA not only massively enhance their intelligence and teamwork, and also amps their bite and size, like massively amps their size. Some of these guys get far larger than a Tyrannosaurus Rex, with the workers being a little bit smaller than, well, arguably a little bit smaller than Rexy. The reason they're arguably a little bit smaller is despite having less body size, they do have an exoskeleton that is a little heavy, and their bones are a little denser than they should be. So they are fairly heavier than they realistically should be, but I mean, they're still super fast and extremely dangerous. And also the dragons, the flying variants, stuff like that, stuff like the builder, those ones have less dense bones and their exoskeletons are a lot thinner, so they're actually significantly lighter than the warriors, despite the warrior being like tiny in comparison to the dragon. They're almost the same weight. So yeah, keep that in mind when you watch the fight animation. But the reason I keep referring to these guys as hives and all that is because they have 2 separate ants to their DNA, as well as the Asian Giant Hornet. The Asian Giant Hornet not only gives them massive wings for certain variants that allow it to fly, but also gives it a massive stinger at the end of their tails. Most variants have the massive stinger. The stinger does vary depending on variant though. And although the stinger itself is significantly larger than that of a wasp, the venom itself isn't like proportionally it's like the same amount that a wasp can give per size. So it's still enough to actively kill an opponent more times than not, or at the very least seriously injure them. But the tail itself isn't something they're always going to opt to use, largely due to the fact that although it is a very dangerous weapon, if an opponent bites onto their tail, they're kind of screwed. They would lose their tail permanently. They don't exactly have a way to regenerate from that. So more often than not, they're going to opt to use their massive claws and mouth, as it's easier to actually kill an opponent like that than potentially put themselves in a very vulnerable situation with a failed tail attack. Dragons are usually the ones that will use their tails the most, as they use them for aerial attacks and sometimes just use them to toss opponents around and ragdoll them. However, both workers, builders, and basically every other variant will use their tails, just their tails are a lot smaller in proportion to the body compared to stuff like dragons and hive queens. So more often than not, they're going to opt for their arms and teeth instead. Also, forgot to mention somehow, but they also have killer bee DNA. It basically does everything the wasp DNA does, but also makes the venom a kind of hybrid of the two. I don't know how I forgot to mention that, but it's literally in my notes, so I guess I just didn't read it, but whatever. Their stingers are essentially a kind of hybrid of both. They produce both types of venom and inject them at the same time. The venoms are not mixed, but they come from 2 separate glands within the tail. So it's essentially a double venom attack. It's still not any more effective than I was hyping it up to be. It's probably lethal regardless, but Yeah, there's 2 separate venoms in there. And the killer bee obviously helps with hives and all that. With most of the time, the workers take more DNA from the killer bee, and the actual like warriors and dragons and all that take more DNA from the hornet. They both obviously still have traits of both, and obviously the killer bee is part of the reason why they're so aggressive and so territorial in comparison to other creatures that would have similar DNA to them, like the actual base of their genome, the mouth. So that's why they're so hyper aggressive and all that. And for the final 2 DNA, we have Megalograptus, aka a type of sea scorpion, and the direwolf. The direwolf is only really there to slightly boost their social skill. Yes, I know direwolves were nowhere near as social as modern day wolves, but it still should help slightly, and also just further enhance their intelligence and all that, as canines are hyper intelligent in a lot of ways in comparison to most animals like them. They're not as smart as a chimp or even an orca, but they're still smart enough to give this creature a slight boost in certain areas. And the Megalograptus DNA is there for mostly warriors, but it also helps other variants. The massive claws on these things, which aren't even really claws, they're just massive spiked arms, actually appear on the fighter variant and the worker variant of both of this creature. The warrior variants have the largest arms like this, with the arms basically being their equivalent to the wings of most of their other variants. But the arms on this creature are extremely deadly. They hit with the same force as their normal arms, and they're spiked into oblivion. So, yeah, that's pretty deadly. And the spikes also appear on other variants, like the dragon has spikes on her arms, and I believe on her wings. And it also alters the shape of her stinger, giving her multiple stingers at the end of her tail. And hive queens are like spiked into oblivion and have multiple arms and legs, kind of like a sea scorpion. They also are the most amphibious variant of them, as most variants are either built for land and sky, built for land, or built pretty much exclusively for the water. Whereas hive queens can basically go wherever they want, and some of them can literally go wherever they want, as some of them are massive and have wings. But regardless of all that, yeah, some of these guys have 4 arms. That's basically the whole point of the sea scorpion DNA. It also gives them an even stronger exoskeleton. So with the genomes out of the way, in a process I thought would take a lot less time than it did, and let's move on to the overall categories. Starting off with size, yeah, this is a kind of tricky one. As technically speaking, the largest members of the Atroxvolucris species would realistically dwarf basically any Ptinvator, but the Ptinvators are larger on average, even for younger members. With the average Ptinvator being around 4 meters tall and up to 17 meters long, which is longer and taller than the average T-Rex, especially considering these guys are typically on 4 legs, yeah, they dwarf something like a worker or builder Atroxvulcus. They are around the same size as a Atroxvulcus warrior, even though the warrior is likely lighter than them due to being a lot slimmer. Obviously, you could argue they'd be closer in weight due to the exoskeleton and all that, and weirdly dense bones for their size, which has nothing to do with the genome, by the way. That's just genetic modifications InGen made, since these guys are not full hybrids, they're more like bioweapons, which is also why their jaws open up wider than they realistically should be capable of doing. But even with that, I still think that on average the Ptinvators are larger, and even though the dragon Atroxvulcus is significantly larger in overall volume, her weight shouldn't be that much above the average Ptinvator, and exceptional individuals like Furiosa should actually weigh a little bit more than her due to the dragons having not fully hollow, but essentially less dense bones than a creature their size should have, and also having a much thinner exoskeleton. I do think that that Furiosa herself should be significantly heavier than her in terms of overall weight, especially considering these guys have a larger weight than pretty much any actual theropod in the Jurassic World verse, completely dwarfing even the Giga, which weighs 13 tons. So yeah, they're kind of crazy in the weight category. So this point goes to the Ptinvators. Now to bite effectiveness. This one's a little more debatable, as due to the venom, the Atroxvulcus's bite likely would hurt worse than even Furiosa's overpowered bite. But let's face it, a creature with Tyrannosaurus, Dinosuchus, and Giga DNA is going to have one hell of a bite, regardless of what this opponent has. And the Atroxvulcus's bite, though venomous, isn't really all that strong for its size. The mouth doesn't have a very dangerous bite overall. It's still obviously effective, but compared to something like a T-Rex, Giga, or straight up Super Crocodile, yeah, no, that's not doing all that much. When you add in the fact that the ant venom isn't even that, like, they don't have a lot of it in their bite, especially considering their size, you would assume they'd have a lot more, but they really don't. The reason they don't is because it's a lot harder to produce that amount of venom when you also have so much venom produced for your tail. And the fact that typically their normal weapons are more than effective enough when they're basically jumping everything they fight. So for this, I do think the Ptinvators do have a actually more effective bite. Realistically, it might hurt a little less because there isn't a basically super venom being pumped at their opponents when they bite. But Ptinvators are actually somewhat resistant to poison due to being basically crocodilian when it comes to their overall immune system, and the fact that their bite is significantly stronger, likely stronger than a real-life Tyrannosaurus or even the Jurassic Park variant, which has a stronger bite, by the way. So, yeah, they take bite effectiveness pretty easily. When it comes to speed, it's a completely different story, however. Atroxvulcuses are incredibly fast, often catching their opponents off guard by how fast they can be. So they can run on 2 legs, they can run on 4 legs, and some of them can fly at speeds that basically dwarf most real-life animals. So the fact that they're able to essentially travel at stupid speeds in basically any terrain, including some of them that can move at insane speed in water, yeah, they're definitely taking this. Another thing to back this up is that the creator of the Ptinvators himself has basically explicitly stated that they rely on stealth to actually take down prey and can't keep their maximum speed up for very long. Their maximum speed is also under most Jurassic World theropods, which the Atroxvulcuses can regularly basically speed blitz when they catch them off guard. So yeah, the Atroxvulcuses take this, and pretty much every variant of them would be faster than the Ptinvators. Now, to auxiliary weapons, I'm pretty sure everyone that's watching this video can predict where this is going. However, I do think it is a little closer than you might assume at first. Yes, the Atroxvulcus takes it. That's obvious. The Atroxvulcuses have way more weapons. They're just great. Their build is basically a walking arsenal. However, I do think the Ptinvator has overall slightly better weapons in areas, such as their bite, that's better. Their headbutt is going to deal a lot more damage than any physical blow from Atroxvulcus would outside of their venom. And their overall build is built better for actually dealing damage. The only way the Atroxvulcus actually basically outscales them in overall damage is through an over-reliance on venom. When it comes to pound-for-pound strength, I do think the Atroxvulcus is a lot weaker than the Ptinvator overall. So, yeah, I do think the Atroxvulcus takes this easily because it just has so many weapons, but I do think the Ptinvator doesn't really suffer much because of this category. Now onto intelligence. This one is also pretty debatable. The Atroxvulcus objectively is the smarter of the two, largely due to it having a lot of orchid DNA. But they're also kind of extremely reckless and hyper-violent hive monsters. So they're not like, they don't use their intelligence as much as an orca would, obviously. And although the Ptinvator is objectively the lesser of the two in terms of intelligence, as its intelligence is compared by its creator to that of like a crocodilian, or at least comparable to it, but like slightly above it is, I think, his wording for it. So they're a little smarter than like a crocodile, like probably like a Nile or saltwater crocodile. They're a little smarter than that. But overall, I do think it's more fair than you'd probably assume. Objectively, the Atroxvulcus is the smarter animal, but it doesn't use its intelligence as well as its opponent would. So for this, I'm giving it to the Atroxvulcus because it technically is the smarter of the two, but I do think the Ptinvator isn't massively outclassed by it. Now to a category I've had in, I believe, every single hybrid fight I've had so far, familiarity. Basically how much the opponent knows about its opponent here. And this one also has an obvious winner. The Atroxvulcus would know a lot more about its opponent than the Ptinvator would. Ptinvators will have never seen anything like this before. This thing is basically an alien in comparison to real-life animals and Jurassic World animals, so yeah, it's going to be very confused. Meanwhile, the Atroxvulcus has actively hunted down theropods that are vaguely similar in overall design to the Ptinvator. It's never fought a creature identical to it, but it has taken on creatures like Lorgadon, even though Lorgadon does beat them and actively escape them. Some of them do still have memories of that, and obviously there's a chance that some of them are in this fight, so there's always a chance they fought something very similar to Ptinvator, and also Ptinvator itself, obviously not having any idea what the opponent is, compared to the opponent actually having faced things vaguely similar to what Ptinvator is going to make the fight very, very different. Essentially, Ptinvator is not going to know how to really approach the fight. It's most likely just going to try to kill the thing, just winging it. Meanwhile, the Atroxvulcris, while very reckless and not as good at planning as most creatures, is going to at least have a vague idea of how to take on theropods like this, even though these ones are a lot larger than the ones it's used to fighting. Outside, I guess, Loricodon and Timatosaurus, but again, they never ended up killing those two, just fighting and failing to kill them. Now to a category exclusive. This fight so far, teamwork. Which one of these two acts better as a team? Well, it's fairly debatable. For one, Ptinvators are usually a family unit, so obviously they trust each other and they know how the others act. And they actively hunt in packs all the time, so they know how to actually work as a team. Atroxvulcuses do the same, but they aren't as closely bonded. Most of them are basically just made to go kill stuff and eventually end up dying, fighting whatever they're fighting. So they're not as closely bonded, but they are a lot more closely related in terms of how they communicate, largely due to the hive queens basically giving them psychic communication. Yeah, I know that's confusing. These guys are bioweapons, not normal hybrids, so they have some very out there abilities. The psychic communication does allow them to essentially communicate better than the Ptinvators would, but at the same time, these guys are naturally reckless, so they kind of screw themselves over in their own X factor there. So overall, I do personally think that unless it's a full-on swarm, fully bonded with mind control, and overall like telekinetic bullshit, then the Ptinvators on average are going to have better communication between two individuals or up to like 5 individuals in comparison to the Atroxvulcuses, which are only really heavily coordinated when they're in a full-on army commanded by a hive queen herself. So I think Ptinvator actually takes this one. Now to the final category, X Factor. For the Atroxvulcus, I already kind of said part of their X Factor, but the telekinetic stuff goes a lot further than that. If the queen, the hive queen, or any hive queen, typically the hive queen responsible for the Atroxvulcus swarm that's actually in the fight, is able to sense that this swarm's in trouble, she can actively not only amp them, but full-on take control of them, which not only makes them way stronger and far more coordinated, as they're all controlled by essentially a hybrid god, but it amps their strength up massively as she's basically flooding their bodies with psychic power, which boosts them a lot. However, the odds of this actually happening are fairly slim. And if it did happen, there is a chance that this backfires and essentially has their bodies breaking down from the sheer force of energy they're being given. Hive queens are more like mythological like monsters than actual hybrids, so giving that actual energy to a not full-on hybrid, but still kind of trying to be normal hybrid can essentially kill them. Their flesh could like literally tear off their bones from the sheer forces of the blows they'd be dishing out. Is essentially what I'm saying. And since most of the Atroxvulcus is currently in lore come from the Hive Queen Tiamat, who's one of the strongest Hive Queens, yeah, they'd probably all die if they got amped. They'd most likely deal a lot of damage, but they'd end up literally just getting obliterated by their own strength, like kind of like what Hank did against the Indom, but more effective. However, the odds of this even happening are very slim, because Hive Queens aren't always paying attention to a measly 3 Atroxvulcuses when they have literal billions to take care of. Also, I doubt she'd really care about losing 3, because she could literally produce hundreds to millions within a day, depending on how many soldiers she needs. So, yeah, if this does happen, it would obviously change the way the fight would go, but the odds of it actually happening are fairly slim, and it could easily backfire. There also are other X factors, such as the queens being able to bestow certain Atroxvulcuses with their own psychic abilities and like insane powers. These psychic abilities aren't just like telepathic communication. Some of them include stuff like pyrokinesis for certain dragons, actually being able to breathe fire. Chirokinesis to certain ones, they're able to give them like basically ice powers. She can give them basically whatever type of ability she wants. There's even some very rare Atroxvulcuses that can straight up mess with time, basically pausing it briefly. However, these ones are also very rare, like one in a million, so like over 1 in a billion, depending on the variant. So the odds of one of them being involved in this fight are also basically 0. especially if it's a small party. Why would she send one super valuable soldier with two weaker ones? So, yeah, their X factors are definitely insane, but they're also like not really guaranteed to happen. As for the Ptinvators, these guys have a also very useful, but far less less out there and less hard to actually get X factor. They have a basically adrenaline rush due to the Deinosuchus DNA allowing them to put more blood to their heart. All that, they're able to spread adrenaline a lot faster, giving them a very powerful adrenaline rush, which amps their strength. Obviously, think of it kind of like a watered down version of the rage mode that the Giga has in Arc, or the rage mode that the Devil Joe from Monster Hunter has. It's essentially that, but like more realistic, I guess. This is a lot more useful as it's actually guaranteed to happen if they're taking a lot of damage, and works for both the male, female, and sub-adult female that will be in the fight. And it doesn't rely on outside forces to actually allow this to happen. So for X Factor, I do think the Ptinvator has a better one, just because it's guaranteed to happen pretty much, whereas the Atroxvulcris, it might as well be a miracle for them to get either X Factor. So with everything out of the way, let's go ahead and let these 6 creatures go head to head. And there you go. So why did the Atroxvulcuses get absolutely smashed there? Well, a couple reasons. First of all, their builder, the member of the group that was like real little, the tiny flying one, he was kind of worthless. The only way he could have brought down a single Ptinvator would be if he was actually able to get a sting off. Obviously, he didn't, because he would not only rarely use the tail in combat for it being kind of something his tail is just little proportion of his body, as well as it leaving him open usually, but he's also reckless when fighting with other things, which kind of defeats the purpose of not using his tail. Something the Atroxvulcuses still have not adapted to not do. So, essentially he flew right into the fight and got smashed in like 2 seconds. He stood no chance. The warrior of their team, although he is strong enough to go toe-to-toe with other hybrids, with some of them in lore even be able to take on Umbreodon briefly, not successfully though, they do lose, sometimes even groups of them lose to him, but they still have been able to endure and dish out some mild damage to fairly similar hybrids before, like Loricodon. However, in a 1v1, they've never won a fight against any of my hybrids, and Furiosa in particular is pretty comparable to my hybrids. Even the normal Ptinvators are fairly comparable in their own right, especially to some of my weaker hybrids like Umbreodon. The odds of them pulling off a win in a 1v1 against one of them are still fairly low. So that basically left only one member of the entire Atroxvulcus team that was able to do anything, that being the dragon. And although I do believe an Atroxvulcus dragon could realistically beat even Furiosa in a 1v1 more times than not, with help from her daughter and her mate at first, obviously he died, but with help from those two, the dragon most likely isn't winning. Ignoring the fact that she's arguably lighter, despite being far larger in volume, she's just not great at fighting large groups of enemies. She's used to commanding groups of smaller Atroxvulcuses to attack things for her. So her getting basically jumped is not something she'd be used to. And even in the actual lore of Atroxvulcuses, other hybrids like Umbreodon, Loricodon, Tyrannosaurus, and Umbrobalua males have actively taken down dragons before. It's never been an easy thing for them, but they've done it before. Well, never been an easy thing for some of them. Loricodon and Tyrannosaurus do it fairly casually. Umbrobalua sometimes struggle with them, but that's only if it's a younger male, and Umbreodon does occasionally struggle with them just due to the size difference, but he still does typically beat them fairly quickly. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily hard for them, but they still do actively sometimes take damage from them. Regardless, though, in a 1v1 fight, I do think the dragon would end up beating the majority of Provinator specimens by itself fairly easily. However, against an entire pack, or even just two of them, the odds definitely shift away from it. So, yeah, that's how I think this goes. The Atroxvulcuses are a very deadly force, but they rely so heavily on jumping things that when the fight is 3v3, it doesn't go their way. Even in their actual lore and fights against equal numbers of opponents, even armed humans, they don't always pull off a win. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You add on that one of their members was basically worthless here, and that even if it was 3 warriors, they would all still be outclassed. Yeah, they most likely aren't winning. The only way I could see a 3v3 going their way is if it was 3 dragons, in which they would win fairly easily, but it's rare you're going to see a scouting party of 3 higher ranked Atroxvulcuses, instead of 1 high ranked and 2 low and mid ranks respectively. So yeah, that's how I see this going. If you guys enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Also go check out my friend Drake and Ash's YouTube channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.